The Mistborn trilogy is probably one of the biggest and most influential gateway trilogies for the fantasy genre. Countless people have begun their journey into wider fantasy thanks to Mistborn, and Brandon Sanderson has done an excellent job of melding deep fantasy ideas and themes with a story that has mass appeal for a wider market. In fact, Mistborn is how I started reading wider fantasy and the Cosmere, so it has a special place in my heart too. But a while back I discovered that there was an era 2 of Mistborn that takes place hundreds of years later. I've already read the first book of Era 2 and reviewed it on the channel, but now I've read the second book, Shadows of Self, and I'm kicking myself for waiting this long to get into this continuation. Now normally I would wait a bit longer after finishing a book before reviewing it in order to give my brain some time to process everything. But I finished Shadows of Self yesterday and I'm jumping right into Bands of Mourning, so before my brain muddles up the events of the second book with that of the third, let me get this out to you guys as soon as I can. Character. The characters in Shadows of Self are quite well done, as is the usual for Brandon Sanderson. Wax feels more fleshed out and introspective, Wayne feels a bit more eccentric but in a good way. Marasi seems more independent and like a person with her own desires and fears. Overall, it seems that Brandon just stepped up the character work all round in this book. Now, it may be due to the nature of the first book as well. If you saw my previous review, you'll recall that I said it felt like more of an introductory book than a major entry due to its length and scope. We were just introduced to the characters and the world of Scadrial in this new, more advanced society, but not much else. Well, in this book, it definitely felt like my assumption was right. Less time is spent on setting up the characters, the setting, the magic, etc. More time was spent on digging into these characters and exploring them within this situation they found themselves in. Marasi is a character that truly comes into her own throughout this book. She goes from being a side character in the first book to really part of the main trio in the second one. Wayne continues being his wacky self, but we see deeply vulnerable parts of him and we also see how he uses his own wacky brain to solve problems and overcome obstacles. Wax becomes a lot more fleshed out in the second book and undergoes some major character moments near the end of the book. And the relationship and bond between all these characters is strengthened and reinforced throughout the whole book as well. Overall, this book just did the characters so much better, and thus I'm happy to give it a solid 8 out of 10. Just a few more character moments shy of being higher, but definitely a step up from the 7 I gave them in the previous book. Plot. The plot in the second book follows the tightly paced thriller murder mystery vibe we've had since the first. There's less Wild West in this book and more Victorian England detective than before, but I feel it works out to the story's benefit. In terms of Brandon Sanderson's standard lengths, the book is a bit short like the first, and thus the plot doesn't have a lot of freedom to meander and branch out. We're given a mystery and an enemy early on, along with an environmental conflict and tensions that rise throughout the book. I don't feel like there's much more I can say about this entry other than how Brandon Sanderson once again knocks it out of the park. The characters have a defined goal and they pursue it with the most logical choices they can make under the circumstances. Events flow into each other very well, and at no point did I ask myself, what is the point of this scene really? Basically just the standard superb work from Sanderson, and I'll gladly give the plot a 9 out of 10. Very well plotted, and it makes me wish the book were a bit longer so we could see it explored more, but definitely very well done and a strong step up from the 6 I gave the first book. Worldbuilding. The world building for this book is a bit of a mixed bag for me. On one hand, we get the expansion of ideas from the first. Technology is growing more modernized, the metallic arts are utilized in society in some unique ways, and the history of what happened since the first era was expanded on and fleshed out. Definitely a step up. But it also seemed to take a step back with certain other ideas, primarily the idea of the roughs and the Colossus. In the previous book, we got some insight into the roughs and we saw some Colossus-blooded people. These were things I was really interested in seeing in this book, but we got none of it. And while we got to see more Kandra lore and information, we still didn't get a very deep insight into their culture or how they developed in the centuries since the Catacandra. On both sides, it seems the world building expands in some ways while leaving other avenues completely unexplored. For now, I'll give the world building a 7 out of 10. The first book got a 9, but that was because it was all introduction. Now that we've been introduced to the world, I don't feel like we got to see it expanded enough for me to say it did better than that. But it's still a solid score, so I don't think it's poorly done at all. Magic. So this will likely be one of the poorest scores for the book overall. The metallic arts have always been incredibly interesting, and Brandon Sanderson managed to utilize them beautifully throughout all the Mistborn books. That said, this book probably feels the most bland in terms of the magic system. In the first Mistborn era, each book expanded more on one of the metallic arts. In the first book of the second era, it focused on showing us how the magic looks and works now in the present era. But in this book, it kind of stagnates. We get no new information, and while hemalurgy is hinted at, it definitely feels like the next book is where all the magical things will start to happen. There wasn't a lot being done that was new here. Yes, we saw how allomancy gets used in unique ways as society advanced, but even that was fairly surface level. Of course the magic is as good as it's always been, but it's pretty much more of the same if I'm perfectly honest. Overall, I'd give the magic a 6 out of 10, a strong step down from the first book's 9. It does some new things and expands in certain areas, but it doesn't feel like there was any progression or deeper dive into the limits or capabilities of the magic systems within a more modern world. And that was something I was looking forward to seeing. Structure. And finally, we're at the structure. How is the prose? Was the book paced well? Did all the different elements fit well together? Well, if you've been watching me for a while, you'll know I've never been a huge fan of Brandon Sanderson's prose. It's absolutely serviceable and delivers the story and emotional beats very well. But I will always prefer more colorful and more descriptive prose over the transparent, almost utilitarian prose used by modern fantasy authors, and Brandon only writes with this style of prose. But moving on from the prose, we have the pacing, and this is where he hits the ball out of the park. Were this section based on pacing alone, I would give it a 9 out of 10. The pacing is tight, well structured, and perfectly suited to a fantasy detective novel. Definitely one of the best paced books Sanderson has done. And if we look at how all the elements of the novel came together, this is another area where I feel Sanderson did very well. Everything in the novel fits and comes together so well. Nothing feels out of place and nothing feels wasted. The whole book feels perfectly designed for a reader's enjoyment. So taking this all into account, I'd give the overall structure of the book an 8 out of 10. The pacing and structure was handled superbly, but I will forever have the prose of Sanderson as my pet peeve with his books. But of course, if you prefer his prose, this section could easily be a 9 out of 10 or 10 out of 10 for you. Overall, Shadows of Self did a lot of things right and managed to capture me right off the bat. The character moments were hard-hitting and deep. The plot was well structured, and the pacing was masterfully executed. And while I didn't love the lack of expansion on the magic, everything came together very well. So overall, I'd give the second Mistborn Era 2 book a score of 7.6 out of 10. And funny enough, that's the exact same score the first book got, though for different reasons. So this seems like a very solid series that Brandon is bringing us, with no signs of weakening or slowing down. I can't wait to read the next book and see where the characters and story is going. But anyway, that has been it from me for today, guys. Thank you very much for watching. My name has been Raven, and I will see you all next time. Take care, everybody.